Iverson Headlee has been a critically acclaimed, award-winning novelist since 1999, and she has been studying the Arthurian legends for half a century. Dawnflight, starring the most likable Guinevere in all of Arthurian literature, was acknowledged as compelling by the Dallas Morning News and intense by USA Today. Kim's most recent full-length fiction release, King Arthur's Sister in Washington's Court by Mark Twain as channeled by Kim Iverson, Headlee, was hailed as solidly entertaining by Publishers Weekly. Its hardcover edition won the 2016 IDPA Benjamin Franklin Gold Medal for Science Fiction and Fantasy. Another of her novels that was first published in New York, the book Liberty, featured a female gladiator in ancient Rome and won the International 2015 Books Go Social Best Book Award for its second edition. Kim's nonfiction book of publishing and marketing advice for authors, the business of writing, and its associated workshops have been well received at libraries, colleges, book fairs, and conventions across the Mid-Atlantic region.
Thank you. So, are you going to be like fielding questions, or do you want me to field the questions, or how do you want me to proceed with this? Mr. Moderator.
Normally,
Go ahead.
people in the past, they've talked about what got them started, in writing, what inspired them, their life story, basically. And usually when you're finished, we have questions for you.
Okay, all right. Well, I will present the same offer that I do to any of the audiences that I talk in front of. I like to extemporize. I don't have anything prepared. It's all up in my head. And if you would like to ask a question midstream, I am happy to stop and field that question. I've found that it's more helpful to do that than for you to hold the question to the end and then maybe forget. So I know I would do that. So I offer that to you all as an opportunity. So my name, as he said, is Kim Iverson Headlee. I have been writing since I was about 9 years old. It began when I woke up from a dream that was particularly vivid, and I thought, you know what, I can turn that into a story. So I sat down and I wrote it. My interest in the Arthurian legends started when my parents, and this is going to date me, but that's fine. I'm half as old as dirt, so that's fine. When I was 7, my parents took me to see the movie Camelot in the theaters. And that movie enchanted me. There were 2 images that I remember when I was 7 that stuck with me. The first image from that movie was Guinevere in her big, white, fluffy fur coat singing about the simple joys of maidenhood and having knights fight for her and all this stuff. And the second image from the end of the movie was a very dramatic scene where the Round Table knights are starting to fight among themselves. One of them gets up on his horse, up onto the table cracks under the weight of the horse in the night. And both of those images really informed my fiction from then on. When I was 9, I picked up a modern language translation of the 15th century work by Sir Thomas Malory, Le Morte d'Arthur. I read it cover to cover at age 9. I'm sure at age 9 a lot of it went this way, but it got me hooked. And so I started writing. I argue that Arthurian legend fiction is probably the oldest fan fiction in the world. And there are something like 20,000 works that have been created, and that includes historical research and that kind of thing. But that corpus of 20,000, of which we have a few up here on the table, is second only to the Bible in terms of works that have been inspired by this legend. And why? Because Arthur was kind of a messiah figure himself. So that whole legend captured me from a very early age, and I started writing. And my goal, as soon as I started reading some of the Malory adaptations and things like that, I picked up on the character of Guinevere and realized that she had gotten a bum rap. And so I began my publishing career literally with a mission to redeem Guinevere from 15 centuries of bad press. So it began with Dawnflight. This edition, and I apologize for all the rubber bands, I've been doing a lot of outdoor events and the humidity makes the covers curl. But Dawnflight was published in 1999 by Simon & Schuster. I began writing this particular version of Guinevere's story in 1989. So it took me 10 years, almost to the very day, to have this see the inside of a bookstore. Part of that was I was learning my craft as a writer, and I was also trying to figure out how to get this thing published. And so I would go through a period of submitting the manuscript to a publisher. And in those days, and still to an extent today, it's true, if a publisher accepts an unsolicited submission, usually you have to single thread it. You have to wait until you get that acceptance or rejection back before you send it to the next one in the line. There are some exceptions to that, but you have to be very careful. So it's best to just err on the side of caution. So while I was sitting around for months and months waiting for a publisher to render a decision, I'd be working on revising the manuscript. And so I had this cycle of submit, edit, reject, submit, edit, reject, submit. And so before I got my literary agent, this edition had something like, I want to say 25 to 30 rejections of various publishers. Now, part of that was because I saw this story differently than it was originally published. I saw it as, well, primarily historical fiction with elements of fantasy and romance and action, adventure, hand-to-hand combat, and all of that stuff. It ended up, this particular edition is Sonnet Books, which was an imprint of Simon & Schuster for romance. And I never saw, I mean, yes, this features the meeting of my Guinevere character. Her name is Gian Amara, or Gian for short, in the book. That was one of the reasons, or one of the techniques I used to divorce readers from all of the baggage that they bring to an Arthurian story with the name Guinevere. So it features the meeting of Gian and Arthur, and so without that, it does drive the plot, but there is so much more. There's an invasion, and she's betrothed to somebody else first, and various things. So when my literary agent sold it to a romance publisher, that kind of surprised me, but so I do have, now that this edition is out of print and I am doing my own releases, I have re-released this Dawnflight with the red branded covers. I have another set of covers that I did not bring with me today, but you can see an example of it in this promotional card. It's a much more fantasy feel with Gian on the front with a sword. I have this whole kind of sword in the stone thing going on, and like that. And Morning's Journey has a coordinating cover in the other edition. Both of those are in print through the wonders of print-on-demand publishing. I have two separate ISBNs because they're two separate cover styles and that kind of thing. But the red branded ones are the ones that I came up with that are more for general audiences. I've found that sometimes seeing a woman with a sword on a cover can scare some people off, so I came up with the other branding. I am excited to announce that I have finally finished book 3 in this series, and this is eventually going to become an 8-book series. So, and it's called Raging Sea, and it features the coming of age story for my Lancelot character. And again, I have divorced the Lancelot baggage by renaming him. His name is Angusel, although in my research into the Scottish Gaelic language and so on, I've discovered that it's possible that his name may have been based on the Scottish Gaelic term Lanciolta, which I translate to mean blade cutting. Lan is blade. So, and then you have the Dulac connection. D-U-B-H, du in Scottish Gaelic means black, and loch, of course, is lake. So he could be, you know, a master of blade cutting from the Black Lake. So that's the thrust of book 3. It will be available, actually part 1 of book 3 is a free digital download, Raging Sea Reckonings, and I'm working on editing part 3. My editor has part 3, and it'll be available, I'm hoping digitally in December, and then December 2018, and in print by February. So, and then to kind of come full circle on all of the Arthurian stories, these short stories that they are for sale, but I also give them away as lost leaders. The 2 gentlemen on the cover of The Color of Vengeance are 2 minor characters whose story plays out across several chapters in book 2, Morning's Journey. And the theme of their story relates thematically to the overall theme of Morning's Journey. Then we have the challenge. We have my Guinevere character, Gian, on the cover of this. This takes place about 10 years after Morning's Journey ends. Her relationship with Arthur is in a different place, and he has been captured in battle by another warrior woman who challenges her to a fight to the death to get him back. And to hedge her bets, the challenger has decided to channel a demon. So this one reads as sword and sorcery fantasy. I call it my chick fight on steroids. It is also being developed as a comic by Tim Shin, who is a freelance colorist for Marvel Comics and DC. Now, some of you all have a copy of the earlier version of it. That artist dropped out of the project, and so it languished until I met Tim earlier this year in February at a convention called MarsCon in Williamsburg, Virginia. So, and Tim is also, once we get the challenge comic done, and all of the interior pages are done, we're just putting the finishing touches on the cover pages. Then he's going to start working on the comic version of Kings. Kings started life as a short story collaboration with a friend of mine, one of my longest and dearest writer friends, who we were trying to create a story. Patricia Duffy Novak, who is a professor of agricultural economics at Auburn University, she is a master at short stories. She's had short stories published in Realms of Fantasy, Marion Zimmer Bradley's Fantasy magazine, and several others that I can't even think of off the top of my head. And whereas I am more comfortable with the long form. So we worked on this short story, and basically the 2 kings in question, the one with the short hair is my Arthur from my Dragon's Dove Chronicles series, and the king with the long hair is her mage king, Garen, from her high fantasy series. And Garen gets banished into Arthur's world literally as Arthur is marching his army to a battlefield. And so it's like, who is this Yahoo? What's this weird blue light coming off of his fingertips? And what do I do with him? So I call this one my darkly humorous mage out of water tale. And it really does read as pretty much straight up sword and sorcery fantasy. Some of you have a copy of another novella called Twins. I've run out of those. Twins features two red-headed young ladies on the cover. They are Gian and Arthur's twin daughters. So that story takes place about 20 years later, and it features basically that it is going to be the genesis of what will be book 6 in my series, Sundown of a Dream. And the way I describe that one is, if you think you know how Camelot fell, read Twins, because I mine the most ancient Welsh legends that date back, well, they were finally codified in the 14th century, maybe 13th century, and written down. It was part of the oral tradition, and there was a series of poems that mentioned Arthur, mentioned Mordred, mentioned Guinevere, mentioned Guinevere's father, so on and so forth. And I drew on all of those to create Twins. Now, I mentioned that this is going to be an 8-book series, and what I'm going to do is a little bit different than what many authors do. Book 6 is going to end up with everybody dying. Book 7 is going to go back to their parents. So you're going to get the stories of Uther and Igraine, and Gian's parents, and Angusel's parents, and that kind of thing. And then book 8 is going to be Arthur's coming of age story, because it's only alluded to in the opening of Dawnflight. I wanted Dawnflight to be Gian's story, not Arthur's. In fact, you don't meet Arthur until the 3rd chapter. So, and I see that novel structure and that timeline structure as kind of the Wheel of Fortune, and the idea that time is cyclical. And so I go all the way to their deaths, and then I go back and bring the wheel back around. And the other thing is, too, it was kind of depressing to think about ending the series with everybody dying. So, and you know everybody's going to die. It's Arthurian legends. But at any rate, so that was my solution for all of that. Welcome. Hello. Now, the second novel that I got published in New York, Liberty is a standalone story. It was suggested to me by another of my longtime writer friends. She lives in Montana, and this was back before a lot of, Google and online articles and things. She literally clipped a newspaper article out of her local newspaper and mailed it to me. And it was an article about some researchers at the Museum of London who were studying the remains of this one person. They found it was a woman, and because of the nature of the grave goods and the richness of the burial, even though the burial was in a pauper's cemetery, they concluded that this woman was either the wealthy consort of a gladiator, because once the way the social rules were in those days, if you were caught consorting with a gladiator, you became a social outcast. And that plays into this book. So they figured it was either an outcast, wealthy consort of a gladiator, or else she was a gladiatrix in her own right. And some of the grave goods included like lamps and other artifacts that had gladiator motifs decorated on them, very specific remains of a feast that was celebrated in her honor before cremating her, and that kind of thing. So all of those clues. So I chose the interpretation and made her a gladiatrix and gave her a story. And this also is, it is a historical romance, all right? HQN Books, which is, as far as I know, is still publishing novels to this day. This was published in 2006. It's an imprint of Harlequin, but it is not your series formulaic romance type novel. She's a slave, she has no control over her own body, and bad things happen, and she has to fight in the arena. So, now the one thing I did as a subplot was I took literary license to move her into an era where Rome was governed by one of the more reasonable emperors. I chose Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who, if you're at all familiar with the Russell Crowe movie Gladiator, they showed Marcus Aurelius in his later years. For the record, he was not killed by his son Commodus. Commodus was a gladiator. He did fight. If you were noble, you were exempt from the social strictures and so on. So sometimes these noblemen would fight in the arena just because they got a kick out of it. But no, he didn't murder his father. He did murder his sister, though, which they showed her surviving in the movie. But at any rate, all of that aside, it's still a pretty entertaining movie. I show Marcus Aurelius in the early stage of his reign, and another historical figure who shows up in Liberty is the physician Galen of Pergamum. He was a Greek, and he is generally credited to be the father of Western medicine. And he had done research using pigs whose nervous systems are very similar to humans, and it's generally agreed that about 80% of his writings are still accurate by today's standards. So, and he got his start treating gladiators and then was called to be a court physician by Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So I've got all of that in Liberty. And so one of the things I like to do is incorporate nuggets of history without giving you a textbook and making it an entertaining story. So, and then I reprinted Liberty. This is a new cover for Liberty. It had a white cover earlier. That was the one. In fact, I'll just have it here. This was the edition that won the 2015 Books Go Social Best Book Award with this cover. And then I decided it was a little too bland, so I gave it this nice light blue with avant-garde with the face turned as if she's lying on the arena sands and that kind of thing. That's one of the wonders that one can do with print on demand and controlling your own cover art and things like this. If you will notice, Gian is blonde on this cover. I had no control. She's a redhead in my book. So that is an advantage of being able to do your own cover design and book layout design and so on. Another advantage is, as I said, book layout. One of the hallmarks of my fiction is, with only one exception, which I'll get to in a moment, I like to write with multiple viewpoint characters. Raging Sea, I was counting, has something like 18. Now, not all of them have, I'm sorry, it's not 18 because some of them have two different totems. But in order to keep the viewpoints straight, I came up with a system of assigning totem art, and my daughter happened to do the art for this book, Snow in July, which I'll talk about in a second. And then you'll see totems as scene breaks and as chapter embellishments. And once you get to know which viewpoint character goes with which totem, then you can see visually, graphically, which viewpoint character is coming up next. And I've had readers tell me that they really enjoy that, especially when I'm going back and forth. And when I have battle sequences, I can have 4 or 5 different characters as I'm composing a battle sequence. In fact, Raging Sea, part 3, which is essentially the second half of the book, probably 75% of that is battle sequences, because I have this whole campaign that I've described. So, let's talk about Snow in July. Snow in July was another work that I had started as a collaboration with my friend Patricia. And as a professor at Auburn University, she had access to their wonderful library. Snow in July is a medieval paranormal romance. It begins literally in the middle of the Battle of Hastings. And originally, let me see, I was going to write the heroine's viewpoint scenes, and Patricia was going to write the hero's viewpoint scenes. So we started writing, and it was essentially going to be just the two viewpoints with maybe another one thrown in to get additional information as needed and that kind of thing. But then a few months into the project, Patricia's life circumstances changed, and so she gave me her blessing to just write the story myself, which I finally did and published this in 2014. And this is also my official young adult title because the intimacy is not graphic. By contrast, Liberty is probably the most R-ish of what I write, but even that is mild by today's standards. So all of these books, from here to here, and most of the short fiction, I had started writing 20 years ago. And they existed in various stages of completion. The only book that I have written since living in Wytheville, which I've been living in Wytheville since 2005, is this one, King Arthur's Sister in Washington's Court. In those days, I still had my literary agent. We actually broke up over this book. But what happened was in 2005, he went to an annual event called Book Expo America, and it is one of these trade shows that moves around the country. And he went to the one in 2005, which I believe was in New York City, where he was living at the time. And he came back, sent out a blanket message to his client list and said, hey, I've met this publisher at Book Expo who's looking to acquire manuscripts that are sequels to 19th century authors' works. Do any of you have ideas? Well, in 2005, people had done Jane Austen sequels, they had done H.G. Wells, they had done Shakespeare, that kind of thing. I said, what about Mark Twain, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court? So he sent that idea back to the publisher, and the publisher was like, great, as long as you update it for the 21st century. So I thought, okay, well, if any of you have any of you read A Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court? You have, okay. You may know that the only major character he did not kill off by the end of the book was Morgan Le Fay. And I thought, okay, I like writing about strong female heroines. Morgan Le Fay has never been one of my favorite Arthurian characters, but let's give this a go. So, long story short, I ended up saving Morgan Le Fay from 15 centuries of bad press. But at any rate, the setup is Morgan Le Fay is upset that the Yankee has messed up her world, so she tries to cast a spell to get herself to Connecticut of 1879, but it goes wrong by 300 miles and 200 years, and she lands literally in the middle of the Maryland Renaissance Fair of 2079. So, and I won't say why the spell went wrong. It went wrong because of a collision with the exercise of technology, but she's thrust into this future world that initially looks kind of like what she's used to, but in a kind of a bizarre two-dimensional way, as these Renaissance fairs are, and then it goes from there. Now, because I was doing Twain, and I literally wrote this as if I was Mark Twain, publishing this in the late 19th century, even down to the book layout, I commissioned more than 100 unique pieces of art. You have the old-fashioned way of naming and laying out chapters. The book layout designer even went as far as to look up digital versions of fonts that were in use in Twain's day, and my editor studied Twain's style, and she looked up 19th century grammar and punctuation standards. So this is literally the whole package as if Mark Twain had written it. And as I said, from a regional fiction standpoint, this is the only book that I've written since living in Whitfield, Virginia. Now, what happened was, and I do talk about this book, Twain really never included a bio statement with any of his books, or if he did, he was kind of tongue-in-cheek about it. So my bio I call it Kaziwick for short because the title is this long. At any rate, my Kaziwick bio is substantially different, and it talks about my journey to writing this book, because after I got the green light from that publisher, I got 50 pages in, and then it hit me. Who did I think I was? Trying to emulate the father of American literature. And so that doubt stopped me in my tracks for 3 years. I didn't work on anything. None of these books, nothing, for 3 years. I finally got out of it by getting onto a treadmill and exercising regularly, getting those endorphins flowing. Of course, by then, if I had finished that book in 2005, 2006, it would have gotten into the pipeline and probably had been published in time for the 100th anniversary of Mark Twain's death in 2010. But because I got the grandmother of all writer's block cases, I missed that window. And then when I went back to my literary agent and said, hey, I finished this book, he's like, nobody wants it now. It's like, okay, fine. I've done this. This has been the book to reclaim my writing soul, and we're done. So we parted ways, and that's when I started doing independent publishing. And even this hardcover is independent print-on-demand publishing. So that pretty much wraps up my writing journey. It is still ongoing. I am fortunate in that I write full-time, write and market full-time. I do not have a job outside the home anymore. I used to be a computer software engineer, database administrator, and that kind of thing, but not anymore. And so that's the focus of my time now, is my writing and promoting my writing. So any questions, comments? I'm just going to pull up a chair while you want to think. Anybody? Are there crickets out there chirping? Eek, 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 eek.
You find it difficult to separate like the actual realistic history from the fantasy aspects of it?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I will, yes. The question was, do I find it difficult to separate the fantasy aspects from the actual history? And the answer is, I don't separate. I try to incorporate fantastical elements in a way that makes sense to people. So, for example, in Snow in July, I called it a paranormal medieval romance. The paranormal element is that the villain is a shapeshifter, okay? And there is enough in legends to suggest that, you know, the shape-shifting is based on something, okay? So, and I tie it to the heroine's gift in that the heroine has this healing gift. That's why if you look at the cover closely, you'll see a pair of hands holding a flower, and there are flames underneath the flower. The flames symbolize the idea that that her gift ignites upon contact with this certain herb, and I draw on the legend of the Glastonbury thorn tree, which is, the legend is that Joseph of Arimathea, who had taken Jesus' body off the cross and buried it in his own tomb, well, Joseph was a tin merchant, and one of his sources was the tin in Britain, and so he would come to Britain, buy tin, and then take it back. And the legend was that he planted his staff on a hill by Glastonbury. The staff took root and became this tree. Well, if you look at the tree itself, it is a Middle Eastern strain of hawthorn. It is not indigenous to Britain. So there may be some truth to that. So I incorporate that legend in, and hawthorn itself has medicinal properties. It can help with heart trouble and things like that. So I gave it an extra power that activates in the heroine's hands so that she can heal people with just a touch. And her cousin, the shape-shifting villain, he basically also manipulates energy, but he does it by sucking life energy out of people and channeling it into himself. So I don't ever use the term in the book, but in essence, he's an energy vampire and she's an energy giver. So their gifts are mirror opposite of each other. And with the Arthurian Legends, my historical series, that's another thing that I do is I incorporate things like visions, which the reason I started Dawnflight in the place that I did, not counting the prologue was actually written several weeks later, but chapter 1 came to me in a dream. The scene did. And I woke up from that dream and I was like, you know what? This is the start of the story. And it became that. So, and then I had another dream later where I dreamed that I was the Angusel character in battle. And the characterization of that dream was I felt that I was him. Not that I was observing, but that I was wielding the sword and the whole bit. So I used that experience to inform what my Lady of the Lake character goes through. She sees visions, and the way she can tell her visions from a normal dream is that she becomes the person in the vision, and she feels what they're going through and that kind of thing. So I draw elements from real life and embellish them a bit because, Arthurian legends, you're expecting characters that are a bit bigger than life anyway. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Are you, as you begin the process of mentally envisioning what you're going to do in a book or where a book is going, does it become a living sort of a breathing organism that can take on a life of its own and take you to a conclusion that you didn't anticipate, or developments within the book itself that go down a road that you didn't anticipate when you began to conceive what the general theme of the book would be?
Okay, so the question is, when I sit down and envision a story, a plot, a scene, does it ever go in a place that I don't anticipate or go in a direction that I don't anticipate? Does that pretty much sum up?
And conclude in a way
And conclude in a way that I don't anticipate. Okay. Complex question, thank you. Basically, with my Arthurian Legends series, the overall arc exists as a timeline. And that timeline includes births, deaths, battles, marriages, and other milestone events in the various characters' lives. And I do that because I'm trying to map my story to a 9th century list of Arthur's battles that he supposedly fought. The list is either 8 or 12 battles, depending on which translation source you look at. And I'm going with the 12 battle list. And so that list of battles, and basically it's the battles that he had to fight to consolidate his power and to subdue or to make into, conquered allies, that kind of thing, the various competing peoples across Britain. And so that list of battles forms the basic framework of the story, and it concludes with the Battle of Baden Hill, which supposedly was the watershed event that caused his kingdom to experience a generation's worth of peace. So that's the goal in mind with this series. Of course, the other thing too is you're dealing with real human beings, or I'm trying to portray real human beings who have agendas and conflicting goals, and sometimes their goals and agendas will run in concert with the main characters, and sometimes they're at cross purposes and that kind of thing. That's life, okay? And so in crafting these stories, I do sit down and I sit down and make a 20 or 30 page outline of where I think the story's going to go, but as I develop it, I give myself latitude to deviate. And so you get things like Raging Sea. Now, Raging Sea, book 3, and so it's not up here on the desk yet. Book 3 began life 17 years ago. Now, for the record, that is not a record. I have another author friend who recently published a book that he had started writing 50 years ago. But so in all of that time, and I mean, I was raising 2 children, I had a full-time job, I had issues with my literary agent, I had, moving various places, all that kind of stuff, that life was intervening. And so as that was happening, my fiction quality was also improving. So when I finally sat down in May of this year to finish Raging Sea, my fiction was in a much better and a much higher quality plane than it was 17 years ago. And that allowed me to do things that I had never envisioned 17 years ago. Things like one of the aspects that I like to touch on is every person is a spiritual being. Whether we acknowledge a higher being than ourselves or not, we are still spiritual beings. And so there is this whole tension. Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries was in a flux between pagan religions and Christianity and so on and so forth. And reading Arthurian fiction by other authors, I tended to see, one of the most famous examples is Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, where her take on it was, all pagans are good, all Christians are bad. And I read that and I was like, no, they're not. I can do better than that. And that's where Dawnflight, in one of Life's Little Ironies, the first edition of Dawnflight, which I call my anti-Mists of Avalon book, it hit the bookshelves literally the day she died, back in September of 1999. So, and so I treat a character's spirituality, and they tell me what spirituality they are, whether they're Christian or whatever. And so I try to treat that all with respect. And so you get this whole spiritual aspect going on that in the background. I try not to be, because I hate reading fiction that's preachy, so I try not to preach. But the spirituality informs the characters, and they're the ones that tell me, what it is they need, what it is they're looking for. And so I try to describe it. Yes, sir, back.
Do you think that, like you said, it can take 17 years to write a book? Because, like you said, you're raising kids, you have a job, and you're experiencing life, and there's changes. Do you think that maybe, in a way, your life changes and experience maybe went into changing, maybe even if in an analogous way, your experiences, you incorporated into your book, and there were changes in themes and storylines and stuff that you, because of how you changed over time? Or do you think it always pretty much stayed this, your idea of where you wanted to go always stayed, the narrative always stayed the same, it just took you time to get there? Or do you think it actually changed and the book maybe went in a complete different direction than it would have if you would have been able to finish it in 2 years?
Okay, so the question is, taking the 17-year example from the development of Raging Sea, did the book end up going in a different direction, or did the narrative pretty much stay the same and I was just trying to find time to finish it? Does that pretty much, okay. I think both of those elements came into play. One of the elements that I haven't mentioned yet was that Raging Sea, my Lancelot coming of age story, was actually suggested to me by my literary agent. He was like, okay, you need to do this, and then we had our falling out. So part of that reluctance to develop this story was because of that falling out. So there's a life experience that impacted negatively on the development. It made me, in the back of my mind, kind of drag my feet. But then as I thought about it, I realized that no, Angusel gets left in a really, really, really bad place at the end of book 2, Morning's Journey. And so I need book 3 in order to get him out of that bad place and back on the path to becoming basically the greatest warrior in the world. And how that path developed then became modified over the 17 years. And most notably, in May of this year, I decided to purchase a table in the dealer's room at a literary convention in Baltimore called Balticon. If you're ever up there, it's over Memorial Weekend every year. Fantastic opportunity. Tons of authors, lots of panels and content, and activities going on, plus the dealer's room where you have writers selling their books and all kinds of fun stuff, steampunk, costume, accessories, and just pretty much everything. But at Balticon, the first night, because from my house to Baltimore is about 6 hours, so for an event like that, I go up the night before, especially if I have to set up to start selling pretty early the next day. So I went up the night before, that Thursday, spent the night in the hotel, and woke up that morning in my hotel room with an idea, literally as I'm opening my eyes, with an idea for the major character, Angusel, that not only informed his character for the rest of the book, but it is going to carry through into the entire series. And basically what it was, he is one of my pagan characters. He's not a Christian. And he ends up forging a connection with his gods, and the gods communicate directly with him through, and this is all part of him becoming, I'm going to use a term that's trivialized. The term is berserker. I call it battle frenzy in the book. And he is a specifically anointed class of champion who ends up forging this connection with the gods. And they are able to give him information that he wouldn't otherwise have. They lend him strength, they lend him stamina, you know, that kind of thing. But the other problem is I had to pull back because something like that would be very easy to dive into the superhero realm, and I didn't want to do that for this book. So I had this one scene where all of a sudden he's hearing somebody's thoughts and he responds to the question in this general's mind, and then he's like, wait a minute, how did I hear his thoughts? And the gods tell him, we help you as we see fit. He's like, really? So he tries to sense other people's thoughts, but he doesn't. He just hears this static in his head. And so that's where I pulled it back from the superhero thing to where he's not always reading people's thoughts. He's just, the gods are just helping him where they know they need to help him. And that whole connection harks back to the Camelot musical again, where if you're at all familiar, the introductory song that Lancelot sings, one of the lyrics is, it's the song titled C'est moi, or It Is I. C'est moi, the angels have chose to fight their battles below, and these gods have chosen him to fight their battles. They're the angels, and that's the connection with the Camelot musical. Other questions? How are we doing on time? I have no idea.
We have a few minutes left.
Few minutes
We have
left.
time. At least 15 minutes.
More questions? Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the on-demand publishing that you do now.
Yes.
How does that process work? Because I've never heard of it.
Okay, the question is, how does the print-on-demand process work? Very simple. If you would like to buy a copy of one of my books, and I don't have it with me here, go out to Amazon.com, go out to BarnesandNoble.com, go out to BooksAMillion.com, any one of those, find my books, hit purchase, and that generates a print-on-demand order. So, and I use two print-on-demand publishers. I use Amazon. Let me see. The paperback version of this is through Amazon. I have them in the back, but these are all done through Amazon. And so if you order one of these, it will generate a print-on-demand. In fact, somebody just the other day bought a copy of Kings that way. And if you go out to the product page, sometimes if it's an Amazon printed book, it'll say it's in stock, which it should, okay, because it's in stock because they can create it right there. These other books, Snow in July, Liberty, and these two editions of Dawn Flight and Morning's Journey, they are, and the hardcover of Keswick, are done through the other major print-on-demand publisher, Ingram Spark. Ingram Spark is a division of Lightning Source, which is a division of the Ingram Content Group. Ingram is the major book distributor for all publishers. So this was distributed by Ingram, and this was distributed by Ingram back in the day, and so on. And what frosts me about Amazon is you go to the Amazon product page for Snow in July or Liberty or Dawnflight or whatever, and it'll say temporarily out of stock. And it's like, what? No, it's not by definition because it's print on demand, but whatever. They're trying to, I don't know what they're trying to do, but at any rate, I'm probably the only native Seattleite who actively does not like Jeff Bezos. So we won't get on that soapbox today. Unless somebody really wants me to. Any other questions? I did forget to pull up my business of writing book. I do have copies of it back in the back. That is also another Amazon title, and And again, you can either buy copies for me today, which, and thank you, or you can go out later to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. They just won't be discounted because I offer them at a discount when I do personal appearances. So, anybody else?
Questions, then Dr. Proxing, if you would like to. This is Dr. Proxing, our president of Bluefield State College, who always makes time for our authors.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here today. It has been really exciting
Thank you.
listening to you,
Thank you.
and just fascinating listening to how you incorporate real life with Arthurian and other legends, and also bringing in musicals like
Sure,
Camelot and,
sure.
and other things. So just really bringing all of this into your work. So I can't thank you enough for sharing your insights with the class, and also about the process of publishing, which is probably just as difficult as writing.
It can be. That's why I published my business of writing book to help other people. So,
So we are pleased to offer you just this little token, a certificate of appreciation for joining us today, and we're delighted to have you with us.
thank you. Thank you very much.